Welcome to Native American history. Today we trace 10 battles that redirected the entire war on the Great Plains. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Between 1862 and 1890, war on the Great Plains shifted the balance of power from the Minnesota River Valley to the Powder River country. The Arkansas and Canadian rivers, the Little Bighorn, the Bear Paw Mountains, and the White River country. The principal actors were Lakota, Oyate, Lakota, Tsistas, Cheyenne, Nimiipu, Nez, Perce, Nu Tsiu, Ute, Numunu, Comanche, Kaigwu, Kiowa, allied bands and scouts, and the United States Army with territorial and agency authorities. The stakes were movement, food, and survival, under treaties that promised lines on paper, while rails, trails, and mines pressed across grass and breaks. This series asks a clear question. What led to 10 field decisions at Wood Lake Sand Creek, the Fetterman fight near Fort Phil Kearny, the Washita Adobe Walls, Palo Duro Canyon, the Rosebud, the Little Bighorn Bear, Paw, and Milk Creek? And why did each decision shape the outcome of the wider wars? The answer rests in dates and places and in logistics that governed both sides. Horse herds powder and lead winter stores, grass and water, and the reach of orders by telegraph or courier set strict limits. Families moved with seasons. Columns marched with depots and mules. The significance is twofold. Tactical shocks on single days reverberated through policy removals and ration systems that followed. Winter operations that targeted lodges and herds ended mobility on the southern plains and set the pattern for later campaigns in the north. These battles altered maps, but the nations named here continued and continue as governments and communities. The episodes that follow maintain a neutral voice and fix time and place so that causes, choices, and results can be seen plainly. The decade before 1862 set the frame. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 laid out broad regions for Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, and others, while the United States sought safe corridors to Oregon and California. In 1862, a crisis on the Minnesota River Valley exposed how fragile paper promises were when annuity payments failed and storehouses held back food. Fighting began in August 1862 and ended near Wood Lake in September. Punitive columns then pushed west in 1863 and 1864 along the Missouri. In November 1864, the attack at Sand Creek in the Arkansas country turned a frontier crisis into a regional war as survivors spread the alarm to camps across the southern plains. Pressure rose with roads, mines, and rails. The Bozeman Road, built in the mid-1860s to the Montana goldfields, cut through the Powder River country and required new forts at Reno, Phil Kearny, and C.F. Smith. The result was open conflict, often called Red Cloud's War, from 1866 to 1868, with repeated fights on the Timber Road and the Lodge Trail Ridge, and a decisive destruction of a detachment in December 18C. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 closed the Bozeman Road and abandoned those forts. On paper, it recognized a large Lakota region, including the Powder River country, and set agency centers along rivers. In practice, survey parties and prospectors tested those lines within a few seasons. Administrative policy shifted at the same time. During the Civil War, the War Department managed many Indian affairs by default in the West. After 1865, the Interior Department resumed a larger role. In 1869, the Board of Indian Commissioners and what became known as the Peace Policy placed many agencies under church-appointed agents. The intention was to reduce frontier corruption and violence. The effect varied widely by place. At some posts, ration distribution depended on transport and contracts and could fail in winter. School regimes that grew later in the 1870s signaled a further shift from military pressure to cultural control. Yet in the 1870s, the Army kept the field role when orders called for arrests, removals, or pursuit. Resources drove decisions on both sides. The Union Pacific pushed across the Central Plains by 1869, and the Kansas Pacific reached Denver soon after. Track brought buffalo hunters deep into the range. From 1872 to 1874, hide markets spiked, and herds collapsed in many districts. Mining booms pulled freighting lines north and west. In 1874, a reconnaissance led by Custer into the Black Hills reported gold. The discovery drew miners through a treaty-protected area and placed the United States on the path to demand new terms. In late 1875, an order told non-agency Lakota to report to agencies by the end of January 1876. Winter and distance made compliance unlikely. The ultimatum framed the Great Sioux War. Immediate triggers tied local fires to this larger fuel. The Wood Lake campaign followed annuity failure and hunger in 1862. Sand Creek followed months of confusion over who was at peace under which flag near Fort Lyon. The Fetterman fight followed a standing order not to cross the ridge without permission and a decoy that pulled a detachment out of support. Washita followed a season of raids and counter-raids in 1868 and a winter plan to break lodges and seize horse herds. Adobe Walls followed the arrival of many buffalo hunters near the Canadian River in spring 1874 and produced a campaign order set for the Red River War that autumn. Palo Duro Canyon resulted from that plan to strike camps in their shelter at dawn and cut mobility. Rosebud flowed from Crook's advance to find and fix non-agency Lakota and northern Cheyenne in June 1876. Little Bighorn followed days later when a separate regiment reached a village of unexpected size. Bear Paw followed the order in spring 1807 that the Nimiipu moved to Lapwai, and the first violence in June at Whitebird Canyon, which turned a relocation into a long flight. Milk Creek followed tension at White River Agency in 1879 when an agent sought to force farming and relocations. A relief column moved with caution orders, then crossed a creek line and met fire. Objectives and constraints were plain. For the United States, the objective was to hold roads posts and railheads and to compel bans to agencies where rations and schools would fix residents. Constraints were grasped for stock water points. Long wagon lines vulnerable to raids scattered columns under different departments and winter cold that stalled transport. Ammunition was ample in depots but could run short on fast marches. Intelligence relied on scouts, interpreters, and part-time guides and could be wrong in number and location. For indigenous nations, the objective was free seasonal movement to hunt, protect families, and keep treaty-guaranteed space intact. Constraints were powder and lead supplies from trade routes, the size and health of horse herds, the need to shelter children and elders, and the danger of winter hunger, if camps were surprised or if herds were seized. Communications were fast by rider across known draws and ridges, but could fail between widely spread Allied camps. In most years, weather was the great decider. Deep snow aided a night approach and hurt a retreat. Summer heat slowed foot marches to waterholes. Across the period, proximate sparks touched these deeper structures of treaty terms, rails, mines, buffalo, decline, and policy shifts from soldiers to agents and schools. In late November 1864 on Sand Creek in the Arkansas country, pressure that had been building through a year of mixed signals broke in cold dawn light. Bands of Tsistas Cheyenne and Hinono, Aitano, Arapaho, under leaders who had sought protection near Fort Lyon, kept a village on open ground with lodge rows along the bend. Snow traced the banks and held tracks crisp. Runners had carried assurances that a nearby post recognized their non-hostile status. Yet volunteer officers argued that any camp off the agency line was a threat. Couriers moved between the post and outlying companies in the days before the attack. On the night march, interpreters tried to fix which lodges held, which families, and which flags had been shown. Before full light, the column deployed down the sandy bed and opened fire. Panic spread through the willow thickets. Women and children ran up the cut banks. The telegraph line at Fort Lyon flashed only after the fact. By midday, the village lay destroyed. The immediate effect was not the end of war, but its expansion. Survivors reached Allied camps along the Smoky Hill and the Republican. Raids on stations and wagon roads followed. Agency negotiations slowed under grief and anger. The Southern Plains turned from uncertain peace toward sustained conflict. 2 winters later, in December 18 in Powder River country, the fight that posterity calls Fetterman's came out of a chain of incidents that had already strained the timber road north of Fort Phil Kearny. The post-cut parties had been harried for weeks. Signals were by volley and by mounted courier because the telegraph did not reach this far. On a cold day with wind out of the northwest, a small mounted decoy party of Lakota and Cheyenne showed itself just beyond the timber road and then pulled away over the rise of Lodge Trail Ridge. Inside, the post officers argued over standing orders and pride. The rule to avoid pursuit beyond the ridge without explicit permission had been given the day before, in part because the distance to the timber line and the speed of the decoys made relief by infantry impossible. Nevertheless, a mixed detachment of infantry and cavalry left the walls and followed the trail up and over. On the far side, in the shallow valleys, cut by frozen draws, hundreds of warriors closed from both flanks. Smoke hung in the still air. The fight was over in less than an hour. Signaling volleys from the timber road carried back toward the post, but brought no timely rescue. The immediate effect was more than loss. It made the Bozeman Road untenable without large reinforcement and pushed Washington toward treaty concessions that would arrive in 1868. Traffic along the road slowed. Sled teams bound for the northern goldfields were diverted. The pressure on the Powder River forts became the weight that bent federal policy. In June 1874, on the Canadian River, breaks a third incident escalated pressure into a theater-wide campaign. Buffalo hunters had built stout posts near Adobe Walls. Numunu, Comanche, Kaigwu, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne leaders gathered a large mounted force across the divides to strike at dawn. The season was hot and dry. Dust carried far. Scouts watched the hunter camp through the short hours before light and signaled by horse movement along the ridges. The first blows came early with rapid mounted charges, but the thick walls and long-range rifles held. Bullets chipped the plaster and rang on iron. Messengers rode to hunting camps farther out on the flats. By noon, it was clear that the post would not fall to a single-massed assault. That failure became the signal for a United States response. Orders went out from department headquarters to prepare a fall campaign. Telegraph keys clicked along the rail lines to posts that would serve as depots. Through summer couriers fanned across the caprock to collect scouts and set rendezvous. The immediate effect on indigenous camps was to compress movement toward sheltered canyons where grass and water lasted in heat. That autumn, columns would descend steep side draws into Palo Duro Canyon and destroy lodges and seize horse herds at dawn. Mobility broke. Surrender at posts followed through the winter. These 3 episodes share the mechanics that drove the wider wars. At Sand Creek, misaligned promises between an agency flag and a field column created catastrophe that widened the conflict. At Fort Phil Kearny, a short pursuit over a ridge beyond support turned a running skirmish into a complete loss and forced policy to change on paper. At Adobe Walls, a failed dawn attack against prepared walls triggered a campaign plan that targeted families' means of movement rather than a single defended point. Season and weather mattered in each case. Snow at Sand Creek fixed tracks and limited flight. Sub-zero wind at Fort Phil Kearny slowed any relief from the post and kept smoke low over the draws. Heat and dust at Adobe Walls carried sound and signaled movement, but also drew camps toward canyon shade where columns could strike at first light. Signals and delays decided minutes that became policy. At Fort Lyon, the wire spoke only after the shooting was done. On the Bozeman Road, there was no wire, only volley signals and couriers laboring through snow. On the Canadian, the telegraph carried orders to the railheads, but into the break, scouts and messengers traveled by night to gather bands or to warn of columns. Interpreters stood between orders and understanding, translating promises, threats, and pleas at agency doors and along river bends. In every case, the immediate consequences were concrete. Families displaced to Allied camps, seizure or destruction of horses, skirmishes along timber roads and at water holes, raids along stage lines, and within months, either a treaty commission on the Platte or a campaign order from a department office. One short primary source excerpt captures the rule that stood between caution and catastrophe on the Powder River Road. Carrington Post Order Fort Phil Kearny, TAS 66 to 1219. No pursuit beyond Lodge Trail Ridge without express permission. Pickets will hold the timber road and signal by volley. Infantry will not be detached beyond supporting distance. Commanders of details are responsible for the observance of this order. The order is brief and clear. The next day, the pursuit crossed the ridge anyway, and the result fixed a turning point. From these incidents, the wars widened or turned. The narrative that follows traces how each shock day became campaign logic by winter, and how the effects reached into agency squares, ration houses, and later schoolrooms. The 10 field days unfold in strict chronology. Each shows how orders on paper met ground truth in grass, snow, and draws. The order of battle is kept concise. The marches are rendered in plain prose and humanitarian outcomes are stated clearly. Wood Lake in September 1862 set the pattern. Colonel Henry Sibley advanced from the Minnesota River crossings with 4 understrength Minnesota volunteer regiments, a battery section, and mixed scouts. Dakota fighters under leaders including Mediwa Compton and Wapakute Headman chose a dawn ambush near a cornfield and broken coulees on the north side of the road. The march had begun in darkness from the ridge camp. Rations were short, and foraging parties ranged ahead against orders to stay close. First contact came when a foraging detail drew fire in the low ground. Sibley formed companies along the ridgeline and pushed skirmishers forward by rushes. The fight ran for hours with rolling volleys. Casualty returns later recorded modest losses on both sides compared to later plains battles, but the result was decisive because the line held and the camp behind it remained secure. Non-combatants in nearby Dakota camps withdrew upriver before noon. Logistics stress showed in empty wagons and the need to strip corn. Prisoners held by the Dakota were later recovered in the aftermath of the battle and capitulations that followed. Sand Creek in November 1864 transformed a frontier crisis into a regional war. Colonel John Chivington marched from Fort Lyon with about 700 Colorado volunteers, a light artillery section, and civilian guides. The column moved overnight along the sandy bed of the creek to strike a Cheyenne and Arapaho village near the bend at first light. Leaders in the village had sought protection at the post in prior weeks and raised flags they understood as markers of non-hostility. The attack began at dawn from both banks. Lodge Rows broke under fire. Many of the dead were women and children. A withdrawal under fire by bands able to mount and ride left the ground to the volunteers by midday. Casualty numbers remain contested in sworn testimony and later memory, but the humanitarian outcome is not. Survivors carried news to Allied camps and raids along the stage lines, and stations multiplied through winter. Congressional and military inquiries followed. The political effect was to unify resistance and harden Army resolve for sustained campaigning on the Southern Plains. Fetterman in December 1806 closed the Bozeman Road in practice. Colonel Henry Carrington held Fort Phil Kearny with mixed regular infantry, a small cavalry troop, and civilian teamsters. Lakota and Cheyenne decoy riders showed beyond the timber road and drew a relief detachment over Lodge Trail Ridge in violation of a posted rule. The ground beyond the ridge is cut by low basins and frozen draws that mask movement. Hundreds of mounted warriors closed from both flanks and finished the fight in less than an hour. No survivors returned from the main party to report sequence. Post returns listed 81 dead. The humanitarian effect lay in what did not happen next. With the road untenable without large reinforcement traffic thinned, and Washington turned toward negotiation that would close the posts by treaty. The rule meant to prevent such a loss was brief and clear. Carrington post-order Fort Phil Kearny, 6/12/19. No pursuit beyond Lodge Trail Ridge without express permission. Pickets will hold the timber road and signal by volley. Infantry will not be detached beyond supporting distance. Washita in November 1868 demonstrated winter doctrine. Lieutenant Colonel George Custer advanced with the 7th Cavalry, a field strength of several companies, and Osage scouts moving in darkness through timber along the river to the sound of pony bells. The order to operate in winter had come from department headquarters with the scope to strike villages used as base camps for raids. First contact came at dawn when companies rushed the nearest lodges along the timbered bend. The fight spread up and down the river as fire touched other encampments out of immediate sight at step off. Lodges were burned, families were captured, and large horse herds were taken. Casualty totals and the exact identity of lodges struck have been debated since. Returns list soldiers killed and wounded and report enemy dead in ranges that do not agree across accounts. What is not in dispute is the intent to break mobility by seizing horses and destroying winter stores. Non-combatants suffered capture and dislocation in severe cold. The campaign logic would reappear in 1874. Adobe Walls in June 1874 triggered the Red River War. Hunters fortified a compound with thick adobe walls near the Canadian river breaks. A large mounted force from Numunu and Kaigwu and southern Cheyenne struck at dawn in heat and dust. The compound held under long-range rifle fire. Casualties among attackers were significant for an assault against prepared walls. The immediate military result was a defensive success for a small group. The strategic result was a Department of the Missouri plan to break Southern Plains resistance that autumn. Fact and folklore meet here in accounts of a single extraordinary long shot. The record confirms long-range fire and a failed assault. The campaign's decisive blow came months later against horses and lodges in the canyons. Palo Duro Canyon, in September 1874, delivered that blow. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie marched light from caprock bivouacs with elements of the 4th Cavalry Tonkawa and other Allied scouts and pack trains, stripped to essentials. Guides led detachments down steep side draws before light to the canyon floor. At dawn, they entered scattered camps, burned lodges, and seized thousands of horses. When remounting and control became impossible at scale, many horses were destroyed to deny recovery. Families fled into side canyons with what they could carry. Few stood and fought in line. The fight was for the base of life. Returns list minimal Army casualties and report the seizure or destruction of horse herds in numbers large enough to end operational mobility for the winter and beyond. Surrenders at distant posts followed through the cold months. The humanitarian cost was measured in sudden loss of shelter and transport. Rosebud in June 1876 checked a converging column. General George Crook advanced from Goose Creek with mixed infantry and cavalry, heavy pack trains, and many allied Crows and Shoshones. Lakota and northern Cheyenne struck first, across benches and ravines along the creek. The fight lasted most of the day with mounted charges and countercharges, and with infantry holding ridges and knobs. Casualties were moderate but telling. Water and ammunition resupply drove pauses. By evening, Crook broke contact and returned to Goose Creek to rest and reorganize. The planned convergence with another column moving from the east did not occur. The humanitarian dimension lay in the protection of a large village farther north that gained days to move. An after-action line from Crook is spare. Crook after action. Goose Creek, 1876-06-20. The enemy was in strength and fought well. Our command requires rest and resupply. We will not advance until trains are in hand. Little Bighorn 6 days later translated that absence into shock. Lieutenant Colonel Custer moved down the divide toward a large village along the river with the 7th Cavalry, divided into battalions. Scouts warned that the village was larger than first thought. First contact came on the south end when Major Reno charged into the timber and then withdrew to a ridge. Custer on the north end maneuvered with 5 companies and met fast-moving mounted counterattacks across broken bluffs. The north end line collapsed, and the 5 companies were destroyed. Reno and Benteen held the hilltop through the night under fire, and were relieved the next day by a column drawn by gunfire, smoke, and dust. Returns listed very high losses in the north wing and heavy wounded on the hill. Non-combatants in the village moved out overnight, and by the next day the ground lay empty. The humanitarian result was mixed. The victory protected families that day and that week. It also brought an overwhelming winter campaign that did not stop until most bands came to agencies or crossed into Canada. Bear Paw from late September into early October 1807 ended a long flight in snow and rain. Colonel Nelson Miles maneuvered with infantry, cavalry, and scouts to cut the Nimipu near a cold creek under the Bear Paw Mountains. First contact came with a mounted rush to seize a knoll and pin the camp. The siege tightened in freezing weather. Ammunition and food ran low inside the defensive ring. A breakout by a group fleeing north reached the line and crossed into Canada. Others remained under fire for days. Returns recorded Army dead and wounded and estimated enemy losses under the smoke and weather. On October 5th, after talks and signals between lines, the siege ended. Non-combatants were gathered and later transported under guard far from the Wallowa. The humanitarian cost was severe in exposure, sickness, and later removals. Miles left a short line that concedes the role of weather and position. Miles Field Note Bear Paw Camp, 1-1877-10-06. The siege succeeded through ground and storm more than surprise. Milk Creek in September 1879 closed this list with a civil-military crisis. Major Thomas Thornburg advanced from the north with mixed cavalry and infantry companies and wagons to reinforce White River Agency and enforce agency orders. The rules for engagement were clouded by disputes between the agent and New Chew leaders over farming demands and relocations. Near a shallow creek in Greasewood and Sage Ute fighters struck the column. Wagons were corralled and a lager formed. Fire cut teams and riders who left cover. For several days, the siege held with water runs at night and casualty accumulation. Reinforcements under Colonel Wesley Merritt forced a relief. South of the fight ground at the agency, men who went out under a flag were killed and the agency burned. Returns and inquiries recorded the sequence and losses. The policy outcome was removal from core Colorado homelands and a reorganization of civil and military roles in that district. The humanitarian effect included displacement and prolonged uncertainty over lands and resources through the next seasons. Across these confrontations, logistics decided tempo. Grass and water for animals, ammunition in belt boxes and wagons, and the length of lines from depots limited both sides. Rules of engagement shaped outcomes when they were observed and when they were not. A winter doctrine emerged in orders from department headquarters. Sheridan, after action, Department of the Missouri, 1969-02-15. Strike in winter when the pony herds are weak. Destroy lodges and supplies. Bring in families. The war ends when mobility ends. Fact and folklore disputes attached to several fields and are marked briefly here. At Washita, casualty figures and village identity have been argued since the day after. At Adobe Walls, a single long shot is often credited with deciding the fight. The record shows a broader pattern of long-range fire and stout walls. At Little Bighorn, the sequence of the North End fight remains contested in detail among scholars. The outcome is not. The narrative proceeds on what the returns orders and consistent eyewitness lines make clear, and it centers non-combatants whenever policy or tactics place them in harm's way. Turning points in the Plains Wars are not only lines on a map, but moments when weather orders rations and horse herds set strict bounds on choice. The actors are clear, the place is specific, and the effects immediate. At each hinge, the initiative shifted in ways that policy later ratified. At Wood Lake in September 1862, along the Minnesota River Valley, Colonel Henry Sibley's volunteers met Dakota fighters at dawn, when a foraging party drew premature fire. Ammunition was adequate on the ridge, but rations ran short and wagons were thin. The objective for Sibley was to hold his camp and recover captives. For Dakota leaders, it was to break the column and force terms. The ridgeline held. The immediate effect was a withdrawal by Dakota fighters and the recovery of prisoners in the days that followed. A narrow counterfactual remains. If the foragers had not fired early, the ambush might have rolled the ridge before the line formed, yet the presence of artillery and the short distance to camp still favored the volunteers. Human cost was borne by families on both sides with removal and hangings to follow that autumn as the war's punitive arc began. Sand Creek in November 1864 on the Arkansas Bend was a darker hinge. Cheyenne and Arapaho families camped near a place they believed safe under an agency flag. Colorado volunteers approached in freezing dawn. The objective stated by the column was to strike hostile bands. The reality was a village with women and children in the lodge rows. Ammunition and powder were ample for the attackers. Non-combatants had no such stores. The immediate effect was a rout and many civilian dead. Counterfactuals here are not speculative about tactics, but about orders. If clear written protections from the post had been enforced and checked on the ground, the attack likely would not have occurred in that place on that day. The human cost has names remembered in testimony, including White Antelope among the dead. Winter counts marked the year with a torn lodge and blood on snow. Survivors carried grief to Allied camps, and the war widened. Fetterman in December 1806 north of Fort Phil Kearny shows how one violated order can decide a theater. The objective of the relief detachment was to protect wood trains and punish decoys. The constraints were a standing rule against pursuit beyond Lodge Trail Ridge and the impossibility of infantry support once the ridge was crossed. Ammunition was adequate in cartridge boxes, but relief distance and winter wind fixed the clock. The immediate effect of crossing the ridge was encirclement and destruction. Counterfactuals are unusually tight. Had the order been obeyed, the detachment would likely have returned with minor skirmishing, and the post would have preserved strength. Yet the wider fight for the Bozeman Road still pointed toward political withdrawal because the road could not be held without heavy reinforcement. The human cost appears in post returns that list 81 dead, and in winter counts that paint decoy riders luring soldiers over a hill. Washita in November 1868 along a timbered river bend shows winter doctrine at work. The 7th Cavalry moved at night with Osage scouts. The objective was to break the base of raids by seizing horses and destroying lodges. Constraints were snow sub-freezing, cold limited daylight, and incomplete intelligence about the spread of camps up and down the river. The immediate effect was surprise at first light. Burning lodges captured families and seized herds. Counterfactuals stay within evidence. If the camp had been fully concentrated, or if pickets had been deeper in the timber, the first rush might have failed, but winter doctrine would still have sought another village in another bend. The human cost included the death of Black Kettle and the dislocation of many children and elders in severe weather. Ledger art later showed horses taken in long lines and smoke from winter lodges. Adobe Walls in June 1874 on the Canadian River breaks and Palo Duro Canyon that September form a paired turning point. At Adobe Walls, a large mounted force failed against thick walls and long rifles in heat and dust. The immediate effect was not decisive in itself, yet it triggered a campaign designed to end mobility. At Palo Duro, Mackenzie descended steep side draws before first light and seized or destroyed thousands of horses. The objective was to break the means of war. Constraints were slope-narrow approaches and control of captured herds at scale. The immediate effect was a winter of surrenders at distant posts. The counterfactual is simple. If the horse herds had escaped the canyon intact, resistance would have continued into late winter, but powder shortages and grass limits still pointed to surrender by spring. Human cost was measured in burned lodges, lost blankets, and long walks out of the caprock country. Winter counts recorded the year the horses were driven away. Rosebud on June 17, 1876, on benches and ravines north of Goose Creek was the check that set up a larger shock. Crook's objective was to find and fix non-agency Lakota and northern Cheyenne. Constraints were water ammunition resupply and the weight of his trains. The immediate effect of hours of hard fighting was a withdrawal to Goose Creek to rest and reorganize. The counterfactual bounded by the record is that if Crook had pressed north without pause, his worn command likely would have reached the Little Bighorn later, and in poorer shape, narrowing rather than widening options for a coordinated strike. The human cost lay in casualties on both sides and in the movement of a large village that gained days to relocate. Little Bighorn on June 25 to 26, 1876 on the Montana grass turned tactical victory into strategic reversal by winter. Custer's objective was to strike a village believed to be smaller than it was. Constraints were divided, companies distanced between wings and incomplete intelligence. The immediate effect was the destruction of 5 companies on the north end and a besieged hilltop on the south that held until relief. Counterfactuals run tight. If the regiment had remained concentrated and waited for better count and position losses may have been lower, but the village could still have disengaged across broken bluffs. The human cost is recorded in 7th Cavalry returns and in Lakota and Cheyenne, memory of protecting families while riding down the North End line. Bearpaw from late September to October 5, 1807, under cold rain and early snow, ended a long Nimipu flight. Miles aimed to pin the camp and force surrender. Constraints inside the siege ring were dwindling ammunition and food and exhausted people. The immediate effect was a partial breakout to the north and a final surrender after days under fire. An admission against interest from the Army's field commander marks the hinge. Miles' field report, Bear, Paw 1877-10-06. We did not expect such endurance under cold and hunger. Their resistance here was soldierly and severe. Our success owed more to weather and position than to any surprise. The counterfactual is narrowly drawn. If the weather had turned warm, or if more cartridges had remained in the camp, more families might have reached the line and crossed into Canada. The closing ring and the cold made that window small. The human cost includes the death of Looking Glass during the siege wounds and sickness among children and elders and the forced removal far from the Wallowa that followed. Milk Creek in late September 1879 and the greasewood and sage of the White River country closed this sequence with a civil-military crisis. The objective of the United States column was to reinforce an agency and enforce orders. Constraints were unclear rules, exposed wagons, and a shallow creek line. The immediate effect was a multi-day siege until relief broke through while south at the agency men under a flag were killed and the agency burned. Counterfactuals here are administrative. If civil and military authority had aligned on a slower enforcement path with clearer protections, the siege and the burning might have been avoided. The human cost was displacement and the end of residence in core Colorado homelands for many New Sioux families. These turning points return us to the structural forces laid out earlier. Rails and roads fixed timelines. Buffalo decline narrowed the margin for independent wintering. Administrative shifts moved pressure from forts to agencies and schools. Winter doctrine aimed at horses and lodges ended mobility on the southern plains and appeared again in the north. Each field decision sits within those pressures. Where orders and logistics matched ground and season initiatives shifted. Where they did not, single mornings turned into years of removal ration lines and memory marked on winter counts. Law and administration set the long shadow after each field day. In Minnesota, military commissions convened within weeks of Wood Lake and sentenced hundreds. Presidential review commuted most, but hangings proceeded in December 1862, and expulsions from the state followed in the spring. The Department of the Northwest treated 1863 and 1864 as punitive expedition seasons, writing a chain of orders and returns that extended Army authority toward the Missouri. In the Arkansas country, after Sand Creek, congressional inquiries gathered testimony that condemned the attack and reshaped commands on paper, even as raids and reprisals continued through winter. North along the Bozeman Road, the Fort Laramie Agreement of 1868 closed the Powder River forts and recognized on paper a large Lakota region with specified agency sites. In practice, the administrative center of gravity shifted again in the 1870s as the Interior Department and church-appointed agents managed rations, censuses, and schools while the Army enforced arrest orders and removals when requested. The Bearpaw surrender in October 1870 was followed by transport of Nimipu families far from the Wallowa to Indian Territory, under terms recorded in field reports and later agency rolls. In Colorado, after Milk Creek in 1879, civil-military investigations recorded a breakdown of coordination and the White River Agency never resumed on its old ground. Removal westward became policy. Reservation boundaries, annuity schedules, and school placements defined daily life. Agency ledgers record how ration issues grew or shrank with freight delays and contracts. Some years of good transport brought flour and beef on time. Other winters produced short issue days and hunger. The administrative instruments multiplied. Pass systems limited travel from agency grounds. Arrest orders targeted individuals accused of raids or violations of new rules about stock and farming. Boarding schools expanded in the 1880s, and the allotment policy that followed the wars attempted to break up collective landholding, replacing it with parcels and leases that could be surveyed and taxed. Where treaty text promised hunting ranges and free movement, the tools of policy reduced those promises to ration lines, school rosters, and allotment rolls. Land and resources moved under new regimes. In the South after the Red River War, destroyed lodges and seized horse herds meant that Numunu Comanche and Kaigwu Kiowa families re-entered the year on foot, or with a fraction of their animals and agency grazing rules replaced the older seasonal rounds. Leases for cattle, and later for grazing over allotments, changed who used the grass and who set the price. Rail spurs advanced to posts and agency towns, bringing merchants and contractors with freight. Mining booms near treaty lines, most famously after the 1874 Black Hills reports, drew settlers and speculators across paper boundaries. In the north, after 1896, a winter of relentless campaigning pressed Lakota and northern Cheyenne bands to agencies or into Canada. When many returned, the land question turned on survey and access, not on the older language of ranges and free travel. In Colorado, after Milk Creek, the end of the White River Agency ended access to that valley's fields and water. New agency sites reorganized land use around different streams and soils. Demography and health appear stark in the numbers. Agency census rolls of the late 1870s and 1880s show declines from pre-war estimates as disease followed, displacement ration shortages, and travel under guard. Mortality from measles, whooping cough, and influenza spread through boarding schools and agency camps. Birth rates fell in years of poor rations. Recovery took decades. The official records are clinical in tone head counts, age lists, ration tallies, but the lines tell the story of loss and survival. In some districts, vaccination campaigns later reduced smallpox deaths, and by the 1890s, some rolls show stabilization or slow growth, but the demographic break of the 1870s remained visible in every column. Cultural continuance did not end. Lakota Oyate communities maintained ceremony under pressure and recorded years in winter counts that marked decoys on a ridge smoke on a winter river and horses driven from a canyon. Tsisista's Cheyenne ledger art, drawn in pens and pigments, captured horses, taken in long lines, the bright trade cloth of a shield cover, and the daily scenes of camp life that policy could not erase. Nimiipu communities carried language and song through exile, first to Indian territory and then to new locations again. Elders taught names for rivers and plants that no longer stood outside the agency gate. New Chiu Ute leaders adjusted seasonal movements to new agency lands and fought to maintain access to hunting and gathering grounds in the mountains. Churches, clubs, and later cultural committees appeared beside schoolhouses. The pressure of allotment produced counter-movements to hold ceremony privately, to keep names off certain lists, and to use new laws to create recognized festivals that preserved older forms in adapted spaces. Memory took public shape. Sites at Rosebud, Little Bighorn, Bear Paw, and Milk Creek became places of gathering and commemoration. Families returned on anniversaries to place names on markers and to tell the stories that the official reports had reduced to lines and numbers. School programs began to include local history, written by community members as the 20th century opened. Where a river bend had seen panic and smoke a present-day run, or a memorial ride traced the path in reverse as a statement of survival. Ledger books and winter counts entered museum collections. Some remained with families as living documents taught to children with songs. In the present day, the nations named in autonym on first mention continue as governments, with laws, courts, and programs. Lakota Oyate communities govern across reservations in the northern plains, with language revitalization, cultural departments, and treaty offices that engage with federal agencies on land, water, and health. Tsisista's Cheyenne communities maintain cultural centers and schools where students read ledger drawings and study treaties alongside math and science. Nimiipu Nez Perce programs operate language classes, fisheries, and legal services connected to ongoing treaty rights and resource management in their homelands. Nuyusiu Ute governments support education, health clinics, and cultural preservation in communities west of the old White River Agency ground. These governments speak for people who survived the winter campaigns, the ration years, and the boarding school era, and who now write policy, teach, and commemorate on their own terms. The written record of the aftermath is broad and precise. The annual report of the Secretary of War for 1869 outlines winter strategy and field logistics that followed Washita and preceded the Red River War, tying doctrine to supply counts and horse seizures in official prose. The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War collected testimony in 1865 on Sand Creek that exposed contradictions between agency promises and field actions, and those volumes shaped public understanding and later policy debates. The Fort Laramie Treaty text of 1868, printed with maps and agency locations, shows the moment when the United States closed the Bozeman Road and recognized larger Lakota country on paper, even as later surveys cut it down. The Reno Court of Inquiry transcripts preserved the language of officers and scouts after Little Bighorn and influenced how the Army rethought scouting concentration and timing. Colonel Nelson Miles's field reports from September and October 1870 composed at Bear Paw in cold rain and snow record ammunition counts, ration status casualties, and the admission that weather and ground not surprised decided the siege. Department of the Platte correspondence on the Milk Creek fight and the White River crisis in 1879 details the siege, the agency killings, and the administrative failures that led to removal. Commissioner of Indian Affairs annual reports through the 1880s and 1890s add the civilian side annuity lists, school enrollments, health notes, and the first allotment rolls. Together, these records show how single mornings became policy seasons. What followed from the battles returns to the structural forces already named. Rails and roads fixed federal timelines. Buffalo decline narrowed the independent winter. The movement from the War Department to the Interior Department and church-appointed agents replaced columns with ration houses and schools, then added allotment and leases that changed land into paper parcels. Yet within those pressures, continuity persisted. Nations kept language ceremony, kinship obligations, and political life. The wars ended. The governments and communities did not. Across the long arc of the Plains Wars, 3 conclusions hold in the scholarly record. First, logistics decided strategy. When horse herds and winter stores were destroyed, mobility ended and policy followed. Palo Duro Canyon is the clearest case. Second, tactical shocks did not settle the wars. Little Bighorn delivered a striking victory that led to a larger, relentless winter campaign and forced concentration at agencies. Third, atrocity and siege reshaped politics. Sand Creek unified resistance and provoked inquiry, while Bear Paw fixed a memory of endurance and loss that still frames the story of removal and return. Contested points remain and are treated with care. Numbers at Washita vary across reports and later testimony, and scholars continue to debate village identity and casualty counts without disputing the winter doctrine at work. The long shot at Adobe Walls sits at the edge of folklore. Historians accept long-range fire, but assign the campaign turned to months of operations and to the seizure and destruction of horses in the canyons. At Little Bighorn, the sequence and exact positioning of companies on the north end remain argued in detail, yet there is no disagreement about the destruction of 5 companies or the strategic outcome. Even where figures differ, the direction of consequence is not in doubt. Roads closed or opened, removals proceeded, and agency systems expanded as each fight rippled outward. The enduring legacies took several forms. Doctrine shifted toward winter strikes aimed at lodges, food, and horses, a method later formalized in department orders. Civil and military reform followed scandal and defeat. Congressional inquiries after Sand Creek altered commands and helped define expectations for agency protection and military oversight. The Fort Laramie Agreement of 1868, born partly from the failure to hold the Bozeman Road, put a large Lakota country on paper before later surveys and policies cut it down. Administrative practice evolved from columns in the field to ration houses pass, systems, schools, and allotment, embedding military outcomes into law and daily life. Memory became public. Ledger art, winter counts, memorial rides, and national monument designations set names and dates into shared space. At the same time, present-day governments of Lakota, Oyate, Tsistas, Cheyenne, Nimiipu, and New Tsiu maintain language, ceremony, education, and legal programs that place this history within a longer story of continuance. Placed against the structure laid out earlier treaties narrowed by rails and mines, Buffalo decline shifts from war to interior. The 10 battles show how decisions made at dawn on specific ground produce policy seasons that lasted for generations. They remain instructive because they tie field choices to administrative outcomes and to living communities. This episode endures in memory because it shows with dates and places how control of movement decided both the end of open war and the survival of nations that continue today. From Sand Creek to Bear Paw, choices on a map reached into family life and community memory. Which moment made you think the most, and why? Leave a comment to keep the discussion going. Thank you for watching.